It was what we call green design. It's this idea of using less energy, more recycled materials, all of that kind of stuff. But in 2012, when Superstorm Sandy hit, and we saw the impacts that even in an area of the country that had all these LEED certified buildings had, the number of buildings that were damaged, the economic losses, and look down here at the bottom, 10 million cubic yards of debris were generated in that storm. Well, all that debris had to be hauled away in trucks, which emitted a lot of fumes and chemicals and carbon. It was all stored in landfills, all that debris, and so it leached toxic chemicals into the air and water. And then, of course, you had to build 10 million new cubic yards of stuff. So it really, it raised the question, how sustainable is it if we have a green building, but if it has to be replaced every time there's a big natural disaster? So that's really when this idea of, resilience is sort of the other half, as Tracy said, about the environment having a low impact on us, that we have to face if we really want to talk about true sustainability. And as I said in the beginning, resilience is really something that we think about on a community or a business level. We can't avoid disasters happening. We can't pick up LA and move it to a place where there are no earthquakes any more than we can pick up New Orleans and move it out of a hurricane zone. So the earthquake will happen, the disaster will happen, and what defines us as resilient is how quickly we recover from it, how we can reduce the impacts of that disaster, and then how quickly we can kind of get back to doing what we do, whether we're a city or a business or whether it's your family, right, after a natural disaster. So with that in mind, the U.S. Resiliency Council still makes the argument, though, that but almost no matter what functions a community or a business has, it occurs in buildings, right? If buildings don't perform well in natural disasters, then it's very difficult for our communities or our businesses to recover, because we don't, sleep outside typically. We don't, we work in buildings, we shop in buildings, that kind of thing. So that's what the U.S. Resiliency Council is all about. It's about how we measure the performance of buildings in natural disasters, improve that performance, and thereby improve the resilience of our communities. Now, it's a pretty sobering fact. This is obviously the city of Los Angeles. This is a map of the age of buildings in the city of L.A. Now, I know you see all the colors. But what you'll notice is that if we think about modern building codes, building codes that have sort of recognized what happens in disasters and earthquakes, how it affects buildings, we're really talking about buildings built maybe from the mid-1990s forward, okay? And if you look at this map, you'll see that that's only at the far end, these orange buildings and maybe some of these sort of pink buildings. And if you look at all of the buildings in LA, what you notice is that about 90% of the building stock wasn't built to modern codes, all right? And so these are the kinds of risks we face, and this could be San Francisco, this could be Portland, it could be Seattle, any major city is going to be like this, where most of its buildings are old, built before we learned a lot about how buildings perform in natural disasters. So some cities, particularly some in Southern California like Santa Monica, have really taken the lead in saying, well, the first thing we have to do is identify the buildings that are potentially vulnerable. The Representative Assemblyman Nazarian mentioned AB 429, which would make this sort of a statewide mandate to identify vulnerable buildings. Cities like Santa Monica, Los Angeles, and others have taken it upon themselves to pass ordinances to do the same thing. But Santa Monica has identified its major types of vulnerable buildings, like unreinforced masonry, soft stories, older concrete, older steel, tilt-up type structures. And now it has in place a plan to retrofit all of these buildings over the next 10, 20 years. So really, if you want to look to a city that is doing it right, that is working towards addressing its vulnerable buildings, Santa Monica is really one of the best examples. And the U.S. Resiliency Council is working with Santa Monica now to try and go a step further and say, okay, well, how can we maybe incentivize, not necessarily mandate, but how can we incentivize building owners who are going to be building new buildings to build them more resiliently. And I'll show you an example of why that's achievable and why that's, I think, important. So the U.S. Resiliency Council, sort of similar in concept to LEED, which you're probably all familiar with. The idea is that we've developed a rating system for buildings that goes beyond just looking at safety. I showed you that example of Los Angeles, and 90% or so of buildings don't meet modern codes. But the ones that do meet modern codes are primarily designed just for safety, just that first dimension there, okay? But real resilience-based design requires that we look at the other dimensions of damage as well. Damage, how much it costs to repair a building, and recovery time, how long it takes to get back in business, right? Because really, if you really want to measure resilience, it's about all of these things. Obviously, safety is the most important, but it's also important that we recover from the disaster. And what we find is that the cost for a new building to go from one that just meets the minimum requirements of the code and is safe to one that is not only safe but occupiable and potentially functional soon after an earthquake is only on the order of a couple of % at most. And so I kind of posed this question. If you had a Corvette that cost $80,000, a new Corvette, and you drove it into a wall at 30 miles an hour, you'd walk away from that because of all the safety features that are in new cars today. But that Corvette would be a total loss. But if for an extra 1%, let's say, of that $80,000, for an extra $800, if you had invested that in the car, not only would it be safe after it drove into a wall, but it might be in the shop for 2 days and then would be as good as new. Wouldn't you make that investment? So if you'd make that investment for an $80,000 car, why not for an $8 million or an $80 million building, right? The same kind of factors apply. Now, in some parts of the world, we see a lot of recognition for buildings that are built to high-performing seismic standards. In San Francisco, if you build a building that meets LEED requirements, it's LEED Gold or LEED Platinum, you'll get a discount on, or you'll get to increase your rents or increase your property values because people will pay more to be in a LEED certified building. But right now, they won't pay more to be in a seismically resilient building, which seems really odd. But in places like Tokyo, Japan, you can get up to 40% more value for your building if you include high-performing seismic systems. And the pictures on the right kind of indicate this. I Google searched, a luxury apartment in San Francisco, right? And that's the picture that came up in the top right. Somewhere on a roof with nice, comfortable couches and a nice big fire pit overlooking some beautiful scene, right? That's what sells a multi-million-dollar apartment complex in San Francisco. The picture on the bottom right was taken by a buddy of mine on the Tokyo subway. And that is an advertisement for a multi-million-dollar apartment complex in Tokyo. And what's that a picture of? It's a picture of the basement of the building and the base isolators in the bottom of the building. Okay? That's what sells a multi-million-dollar apartment in Tokyo. Now, we need to get the United States to start thinking more like Japan does when it comes to the value of valuing the resilience of its building stock. And we're starting to do that. So we're seeing examples now throughout the state, throughout the country actually, of buildings that have been designed to or retrofitted to achieve these high-performing standards developed by the U.S. Resiliency Council. This is a civic building in Roseville, California, which is outside Sacramento. And it was designed to have using an innovative kind of precast concrete moment frame. And after the fact, after the building was built on time and on budget, the engineer realized that it was going to perform really, really well in an earthquake, and so they got a U.S. Resiliency Council Platinum rating, which means this building should be not only safe, of course, but essentially functional and usable after an earthquake. This one I'm very proud of, and this is one that I really hope folks in Los Angeles will take note of, as affordable housing is the biggest issue in so many parts of the state, but certainly in Southern California. This is a building that is literally almost complete now. It'll start getting occupants in the beginning of the year. It's a 9-story concrete affordable housing apartment in San Francisco. 100% affordable housing, 20% of these people were at one time homeless. And the engineer, though, decided they would use an innovative little shock absorber system in the basement of the building to protect the walls of the building. And this building ended up getting a USRC gold rating, which means that the occupant should be able to shelter in place after an earthquake, and the building should be functional maybe within a couple of weeks. Alternatively, a building like this is normally built to the very lowest requirements of the code, right? Because a developer doesn't want to spend an extra buck on anything, right? Because it's low-income housing. And this building ordinarily could have been essentially safe but a total loss. And so where would these people go? They're already vulnerable, right? Part of our vulnerable population. They are also the least likely to be able to get housing afterwards. But the cost of that innovative damping system, on a $42 million building, it was about $100,000, less than 0.25%. Okay, so this is a case where we have the technology now to build things like affordable housing that are also resilient, so that we're not just, you know, leaving resilience up to the folks like Apple with their base isolated spaceship, right? That everybody can take advantage of this. I'm going to kind of move along because I don't have much time. These are unreinforced masonry buildings in Portland, Oregon. Okay, all of these buildings underwent significant renovations, and so they were all brought up to current code by adding new concrete walls and steel frames and fixing the floors to all of these buildings. And so they were able to achieve silver ratings, which means, one, that they'd be safe after a major earthquake in the Portland area, and two, they should be repairable, that it should be economical to repair them, even if it takes a few months. So we're seeing that this is possible not only with new buildings, but with existing buildings as well. And so what is the U.S. Resiliency Council trying to do? What do we want to do with cities right now, especially in places like Southern California? Well, we're looking at ways to find incentives to promote more resilient building design. Just like we're working with Assemblyman Nazarian on mandates to do things like build to higher performance standards or identify vulnerable buildings, we know that the carrot is also an important part of this, right? And so we're looking at working with cities, and if any of you represent cities, we'd love to work with you, on ways to, say, expedite permitting for buildings that come in with a high USRC rating, okay? This is going to be a building that might be functional during or after an earthquake or occupiable very quickly. That benefits the city in terms of its tax base, its employment, et cetera. Why not reward an owner who wants to do that with some sort of benefit? Same thing it could be for county tax breaks, right? I mean, you want to preserve a tax break of the tax base of a building after an earthquake is property tax. If it's totally damaged, that tax base goes to virtually zero, and the county loses out. So why not offer, again, some sort of incentives? We're looking at working with lenders and insurers, especially Fannie Mae, okay, who's a huge lender, largest lender on affordable multifamily housing, to offer loan discounts for buildings that achieve certain performance ratings. Why is that important for them? Well, because it reduces their risk of the building being a total loss and the borrower defaulting on their loan. So we really like to work in Southern California promoting this idea of mortgage and insurance discounts for buildings that meet certain performance levels. So in all of these ways, the U.S. Resiliency Council is trying to work with cities and lenders and other organizations, and we would love to work, you know, with more folks in Southern California to promote this idea that resilience is good business, it's good for communities, it's good for obviously the people that live in these cities, and it's affordable and doable. I'm going to skip that just because of the interest of time. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'll be around a little bit afterwards if you have any questions. Thanks.